It was a small town nestled between dense woods, where the sun barely managed to peek through the thick canopy of trees. The town had a history that few spoke of, an ancient past steeped in secrets, forgotten stories, and things best left untouched. The cemetery on the outskirts of town had been there for as long as anyone could remember, the gravestones weathered and covered in moss, the names fading into obscurity. It was a place people rarely visited, except for the occasional mourner or curious wanderer, and even they would leave quickly, as if compelled by some unseen force. I had never been one to believe in ghosts or the supernatural, and the cemetery, despite its gloomy appearance, never bothered me. But when I arrived in town as a newcomer, I couldn't help but be drawn to it. There was something about the place that seemed to whisper to me, calling me in ways I couldn't explain. Maybe it was the silence, the way the air felt different there, thick with history. Or maybe it was something deeper, something I had yet to understand. I was in my late 20s, having just moved to this town to escape the hustle and bustle of city life. The idea of starting over, away from the noise and chaos, seemed like the perfect solution. The house I rented was old, not unlike the town itself, but it had character. It was creaky, with wood floors that groaned beneath my feet and walls that seemed to have a story of their own. But it was affordable, and the peace of the place was soothing. However, there was one thing about the town that didn't sit well with me, the cemetery. It wasn't just the graveyard itself, but the stories surrounding it. Locals often spoke in hushed tones about it, as if mentioning it aloud might stir something that was better left dormant. They talked about a particular grave, one that had been forgotten over time, a grave that was never tended to. The name on the headstone was barely legible, and the soil around it was always strangely unsettled, as if someone or something was still trying to escape. I didn't believe in such superstitions. At least, not until I visited the graveyard one evening. The sun was just beginning to dip behind the horizon, casting a golden glow over the cemetery. I wandered through the rows of gravestones, reading the inscriptions on each one, marveling at how old they were, when something caught my eye, a grave set apart from the others. It wasn't the oldest, nor the most weathered, but there was something about it that seemed wrong. The grave had been left untended, the grass around it overgrown, and the headstone had a strange, jagged crack running down the middle. The name was almost unreadable, but I could make out just enough to know it wasn't a name anyone would want to forget. It read, Mary Larkin, 1803 to 1827. The inscription was simple, but there was a heavy weight in the air as I stood there, staring at it. I didn't know why, but I felt a cold shiver run down my spine, like the air itself had turned frigid. And then out of nowhere, I heard it, a soft, muffled sound, almost like a cry. I turned quickly, expecting to see someone nearby, but there was no one. The cemetery was as empty as ever, the only movement the rustling of the trees in the wind. But the sound persisted, faint at first, like a whisper, and then growing louder, more desperate. It was a cry. My heart began to race. The sound seemed to come from below the ground, as if someone was buried beneath the very spot where I stood. The noise wasn't just one cry, but a chorus of muffled sobs and anguished wails. I could feel it in my chest, this suffocating sense of grief and loss that seemed to seep into my bones. I tried to convince myself it was just the wind, or maybe my imagination playing tricks on me. But the sound wouldn't stop. It continued, growing louder and more frantic, until I couldn't ignore it any longer. I knelt down beside the grave, my hands trembling as I pressed them against the cold stone. There, in the silence of the night, I heard the distinct sound of a hand, small and delicate, pounding against the earth. "Help me," a voice whispered, so faint it was barely audible but unmistakable. My stomach turned, and I stumbled back, my heart racing as I looked around in panic. Was it possible someone had been buried alive here? Was this some kind of sick joke? But no one had lived in this town for over a century, and the grave, Mary Larkin's grave, was centuries old. No, the cries were not from the living. They were coming from something else, something darker. I couldn't tear myself away. My legs felt frozen to the spot, and I could hear my own breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. The cries had turned to screams now, desperate, pleading. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the sound stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, my heart pounding in my ears. I wanted to run, to escape the graveyard and never return. But something kept me rooted to the spot. My mind raced, searching for an explanation, anything to justify the horror I had just experienced. But there was none. I took a step back, then another, until I was a good distance away from the grave. I turned and fled from the cemetery, my heart thumping in my chest, my breath ragged with fear. That night, I lay in bed, the memory of the cries echoing in my mind. I tried to dismiss it as a hallucination, a product of too much stress, but deep down I knew better. There was something in that graveyard, something tied to Mary Larkin, something that refused to be forgotten. The next morning, I returned to the graveyard, hoping to make sense of what had happened. But when I arrived at the grave, it was just as it had been the day before. No signs of disturbance, no new marks, only the same cracked stone, weathered by time. But as I turned to leave, something caught my eye. Just beneath the gravestone in the soft earth, I saw something shining, an old locket. I knelt down to pick it up, my fingers trembling. It was a delicate gold locket, tarnished with age. I opened it, and inside was a small, faded photograph of a young woman. Her eyes were sad, her expression distant, as though she were looking out from another time, another world. As I stared at the locket, I felt a sudden chill crawl up my spine. I had no explanation for it, but I knew that the cries from the forgotten grave were not over. Mary Larkin's story was not finished, and neither was mine. I walked away from the cemetery that day, locket in hand, but the cries followed me, lingering in the air, echoing in the corners of my mind. They would never stop, and neither would the story of the forgotten grave.